All right. So this would be I'll prefer this to be an interactive session if possible. But if that's not possible, I'm gonna have some exercises which you can just do on your own. Just maybe write them down, write down the answers, and maybe we can talk about it if possible. So yeah, how to build a successful organization from the ground up. So this is basically a trust first bottom up blueprint for founders and builders on how to build an organization. And this is a generic principle. So that means it can be applied to anything that involves managing of humans. That's the plan for this. So before I start, I'm going to tell a story that might sound familiar to most of you. I'm sure most of you have had some experiences building organization before, whether it's a club, whether it's a team, whether it's a small business. So I'm going to talk about a guy called Marcus in my example. So he's a guy that he worked for a company, well-known company for a while, for many years. He worked 9 to 5, and he had an idea. He felt like he wasn't satisfied in the company he was working in, and he wanted to do something else, right? So maybe he didn't like the way his boss treated him, or he didn't feel like his ideas were well expressed, or he was reaching his full potential in the company. So he decided to quit his job. And what he did, he's a pretty smart guy. So he immediately registered his company. He came up with a very detailed plan on what he planned on doing, the business he planned on doing. So immediately got a logo, got his website, registered the company with the government, and then he hired his best friend. He brought in his cousin, his family. All right, he hired his best friend probably as the CTO, the Chief Technical Operations Manager. And he brought in his cousin as the sales manager. He found some people on LinkedIn to help him with the business, and he hit the ground running. Right, he came up with a very detailed plan and started working on it. Everything seemed good initially, and then by 6 months in, he already had 8 people. He already rented an office to work on the business. I mean, he had the brand name, he had the website and everything, and he already had customers and everything. And then from the outside, it looks like a real company. But can anyone guess what happens next? Is it possible to get a response? All right, if just write down what you think happens based on this story. Like, does it have a successful company or are there issues? So just write down what you think will happen next. And then I'll talk about my opinion, and then we can compare what you said with what I said. All right, so this story I told follows a typical framework for how most organizations are built. As we all know, most organizations or most startups fail actually. So the vast majority of startups fail. Even if you didn't know that, you can kind of tell, right? If it was so easy to build a successful business, then we would have more billionaires and millionaires out there. But it's rare. Most people don't build successful businesses. Even the businesses that don't fail right away, they usually hit a certain threshold. And there's probably a reason for that. So the reason I believe is because most organizations follow this framework to build a business. So first they have an idea, right? They have an idea which is not really tested. And then the excitement kicks in and they immediately jump in to work on the idea. They don't really like ask anyone about it. They don't do much research. They just go about the idea. Maybe it's something that their family has been doing for a while. Maybe it's just something they know about, something people in their environment do. So they immediately register the business, right? They get a logo, they rent a company, make it feel official so that everyone knows that they are working on the business right away. Then next, they hire people they know. And this makes sense because you want to work with people that you kind of trust, people you know, maybe friends and family. You don't want to really work with strangers because you can't really trust strangers. So you work with your friends and family. Maybe if you know someone on LinkedIn, for instance, or you know someone from your school, you kind of get them in and work with them. No more testing is done. Then they immediately divide up the roles, right? They hand out titles, so they call someone a CEO, a CTO right away. They hand out fancy titles to everyone without doing much testing or much evaluation, especially for younger organizations. And then next, they kind of figure it as you go. They don't really have much of a plan, much of a grand system plan. They just have like maybe an ideal vision and they start working towards it. And any problem that comes along the way, they kind of try and solve it on the fly. So raise your hand if this sounds familiar to you, if this is something that you've experienced before or something that you've observed. Okay, I see one hand at the back. So yeah, for anyone who has had experiences with businesses or even with clubs, I'm sure this might sound familiar to you. So this will be the first interactive session. Just write down your answers and just to keep them in mind, and you can compare it after we're done with the meeting. So I just want to see, I just want to keep a record of how your opinions change as we go through the slides. So the first question is, have you started or tried to start an organization, business, or project before? So just write it down. And the next is, did you bring in people you knew personally? It doesn't have to be an organization. It could be like a club or maybe like even like a Bible study, for instance, or anything that requires working with people. And there is like a objective goal you're trying to achieve as well. So it's not like informal. So did you give someone a big title or responsibility early on without much testing? And then the final question is, did you later regret the decisions? Just write it down. All right. Is everyone done? I believe everyone should be done writing down their questions, right? All right, let's move on to the next slide. So let's go back to the company we were talking about initially. So when Marcus was founding the company, he had some expectations, but let's go with the reality of what we expect to happen based on the data. So the first expectation Marcus had when he created the company was that he was going to have a very loyal and motivated team. But in reality, what tends to happen is the team might be loyal, but they are not very motivated because they don't take feedback. So since it's family, since it's someone they're all familiar with, there's no real incentive for them to really take his feedback seriously. And there tends to be no punishment or caution for bad behavior. So things are done very inefficiently and in a very haphazard way. So that's what tends to happen since they seem as family. There's this air of familiarity they have. So the next expectation we expect Marcus to have is that everyone puts in their best efforts, put in their 100% just like Marcus does. But in reality, as I'm sure a lot of you might have experienced, people don't tend to put in their best effort because it's a family business. They don't do their best. They just put in their minimum effort, and a lot of people don't even put in any effort as well. So since it's family, and since you can't fire family, there is no real incentive for them to put in their efforts as well. So their book is a mess. They do things haphazardly, and you find that it affects the quality of the business. That's why a lot of businesses aren't really run very efficiently. So the next expectation is that Marcus has very detailed plans on how things are going to go. Right, he has plans for where he should be by month 6 or month 1 by working with his family, right? But what he failed to do was to realize that there are other factors involved. He was only considering things. He was only considering if things work in the ideal states. That means if things go according to plan. But he didn't really consider the human factor. And the human factor is often very important in businesses because how effective your business does often depends on the quality of the people you hire. And since, as we talked about initially, most of his employees or most of his family members are not really putting in their best efforts. They are probably not showing up on time. They are not very efficient, not very productive, things go a lot slower than he expects, right? So next, he expects clear rules and direction. So he expects everyone to play their parts, everyone to, put in their best efforts. He expects everyone to, work in to play their parts in the organization, so to be part of the machinery of the business. But in reality, what we usually find is that Marcus does the whole job himself, because since he's the only one that is really passionate about the business, right? He does everything himself. So now let's talk about why this tends to happen. And this is a very common story with a lot of businesses, right? So let's talk about why this happens. So the first reason is loyalty is not equals competency. Yes, he hired people that are loyal to him, his family, his friends. But as we all know, right, the vast majority of people are not competent, especially when it comes to specific skills. That's why most well-known organizations have very rigorous interview processes before they let someone in. But unfortunately, a lot of small businesses tend to skip this because they kind of depend more on loyalty. So by hiring friends and family, it clouds their judgment. They don't really objectively evaluate the abilities of those whom they're hiring. So as a result of that, they hire people that are not very competent. And it's not an insult to them, right? The truth is that it takes a lot of effort, and it's very rare for someone to truly be competent, right? So the odds that the person you know, your family, your friend is competent is very low. So the expectation should be that most people you know shouldn't be qualified to work in your business. But unfortunately, people don't tend to put that into perspective. People don't tend to consider that. So next is they hand out titles and responsibilities without much accountability. So since they're hiring their friends and family, they don't really have an accountability. They don't have a well-defined expectation, right? And they don't have much consequences for not meeting the expectations. So if you have worked in an international company before, or a very successful business, you find that each role has expectations that you're required to meet, and they're usually evaluated either on a yearly or a monthly basis. But most small businesses, smaller organizations tend not to do that since they're working with family and friends, and they don't really have much of a detailed performance framework. So that's another reason why this approach tends to break down. So next is no probationary thinking. So there is no time for them to really test people out, right? To really consider whether it's the people or whether it's the business idea or whether it's the approach they have. They just jump into the first ideas they have, right? They commit on day one and there's no flexibility on their part. So they kind of attach their ego to the business, right? They don't really have the possibility in their mind that they are going to do something different. So next is founder bottleneck. So we find that a lot of people, when starting businesses, they feel very uncomfortable delegating responsibility to people. They might delegate, but they still want to be the ones making most of the major decisions. But the truth is that it's very rare for someone to be competent at everything. So for example, if you're good at being at IT, it's unlikely that you'll be also very good at sales. So if you want to run a very successful business, you have to be comfortable delegating the responsibility or the decision making to other people. But we find that a lot of people tend not to do that. So as a result, every decision must come through them. And that kind of slows things down and makes things less efficient. It also reduces the morale of a lot of their qualified employees. They are highly effective employees, because what we find is that a lot of people, a lot of effective and competent people like independence. If you don't give them that independence, that reduces their morale and makes them not want to really put in their best effort as a result. So next is silo departments. So another thing we find is that everyone is just doing their own job. They are not really talking to others. They're not finding ways to make things more efficient by collaborating effectively. So everyone is just focused on their responsibilities. They're not really thinking in a system way. They're not looking at the big picture. As a result of this, there tends to be a lot of redundancy. There tends to be a lot of ineffectiveness. But in organizations where people or departments or people in general collaborate more, or they take time to see ways of making things more efficient between their departments, we find that it increases the productivity of the organization or the business overall. So next is scaling without systems. So what we see is that people tend not to build systems that scale properly. So for example, this founder bottleneck of a thing might work at a small scale. So it might be possible for one person to make all the decisions when the business is small. But as the business grows, it becomes harder and more difficult, and the inefficiencies become more glaring as the business grows. So that's another reason why businesses might not necessarily grow. Even if they're successful, they might not grow as quickly as you would expect. So now I'm going to talk about my proposal. This is the main myth of the entire presentation. My proposed way of building a business in a way that increases the probability of success. So the idea of this basically is to build trust before you build structure. So basically, don't give someone a seat on the table, let them earn it. Regardless of who they are, whether they're family or friends, you must have a set standard, right? And make sure the person you're going to work with meets the standard. If you don't do this, I believe the business is less likely to succeed. So the general principle is to start small and stay close. Let people prove themselves before they commit, and then grow structure around those who've earned it. So I'm going to talk about different principles that relate to this general idea. So the first is validate before you scale, right? Start small and plan to grow. So if you recall from the initial story, Marcus immediately built a large organization. He registered the business. He kind of rented the room, right? You could say there are some benefits because it keeps him accountable, right? Since he's already starting big and announcing what he's doing to everyone. But it's often better to start small, right? Before you even register the business, make sure you validated the idea and then gradually grow from there. So it's called the ground up method rather than a top down method that just comes in and builds a large structure without really testing things. So basically, small wins build momentum. Don't hire for a problem that you haven't proven yet. So also something to keep in mind is that you have to be very careful when hiring or working with the first set of people because they tend to set the culture of the business. So it's better for you to hire slowly, right, than hire quickly and hire the wrong person. And it's not just about competency at this stage. You also want to hire the person with the right attitude. They call it soft skills. So the ability to work with people, the ability to, not reduce other people's morale, not create unnecessary problems in the organization. You want to hire someone that is well behaved. That's why a lot of people prefer working with their friends and family. But you can also find someone that you don't know that has these traits. But the idea is to test them first, right? Make sure you don't just do like a technical interview. You also talk with them and see if there's someone you can work with, especially the first few hires. Make sure you know them properly. So next is even though you're starting small, you have to design your business in such a way that it's going to scale properly. So you have to imagine your business as a big business and like try and design systems that will work even when the business grows large. So you don't have to be making changes as the business grows by. So you want to create systems that will scale your business. So one of that could be like delegating things well, a system for accountability, a system for hiring and all that. So once you create the right systems initially, then they'll scale well and they'll hire and they'll greatly benefit your business. So the second principle is before you lead, learn to follow. So a lot of people like to jump straight into a business that they don't really know much about, right? They feel like, oh yeah, they have these ideas in mind and like no one has ever thought of this before. But the truth is that it's very unlikely that the idea you have has never been done before, right? You'll learn a lot more from working with someone for 6 months than what you can learn from a book, a course, or a podcast. So This principle requires that you actually swallow your pride or let go of your ego and work with someone for a while. So what it looks like. So the benefits of this is that you can work with someone that has done a similar business before for maybe like 6 to 1 year. And then you learn from them, but you learn in a practical way. So you're not just learning in theory, you're learning practical ways of running the business. A lot of countries actually have apprenticeship systems, and a lot of professionals like mechanics, for instance. But I think this applies to a lot of organizations. So, for example, if you want to start a business, you can find someone that's running a similar business and work with them for a while, then shadow them properly. They don't necessarily have to pay you, but if they pay you, that's an extra benefit. But the point isn't to make money at this stage. The point is to learn from them. So try and shadow them closely, try and be very helpful. And the more helpful you are to them, the more likely they are to, teach you the ropes of the business. Um, then you'll see how the real decisions are made. You see the mistakes and the right decisions they made. Then you can learn from them. Then you can now add in your ideas to what you already know. So that way you don't have to waste time making mistakes that have already been made before you. So rather you can learn from the mistakes or learn from the wisdom of others. It also gives you a chance to master the craft on their dime, right? So to close the skills gap. So what does this look like? This looks like maybe doing an internship, maybe like volunteering your service to someone, right? You don't necessarily have to get paid. This looks like just helping someone, right? Another benefit of this is that you could also build your network. You could get to know people in the industry you're interested in, and then they could be like a future employee or a future investor, for instance, or a future co-founder. So it's very beneficial. But unfortunately, a lot of people tend to skip this because they probably have some pride, or maybe they are impatient. They want to quickly get the idea done. But it's better to take your time to do it well than to rush and do it but in a bad way. So the next principle, I think this is a very important principle, is to end commitment and hire in contract at first. So rather than hiring someone permanently, it's better to hire them in contract first. And the benefits of hiring in contract is you get a chance to test them and see if they have the skills and competency to work with you, and also if they have the soft skills. So if they merge well with your team. So this is a framework I propose, but you don't have to follow this exactly. But this is a sample framework you can follow when hiring someone to join your team. The first is a trial project, right? So before you even hire them on contract, you can just give them a small paid task, maybe like a small task to perform and to see how they do in it. So for example, if you want to hire someone to be your web designer, you can just give them a task to maybe create a simple landing page, for instance, and see how they go about it, right? See if they are able to complete the project on time, see how effective they are, see if they're able to take correction, for instance. Those kind of soft skills, they don't have to be perfect, but you just want to make sure that at least they reach a threshold, the minimum requirements. They're someone that you can actually work with. But what I find that a lot of people are not, even if they are competent, they might not necessarily they might not have integrity. So they might not do what they said they're going to do. They might not be the kind of people to come to work on time and things of that nature. So these are the things you can test in the trial project, and you can quickly weed out those who are not qualified. So if they pass this trial project stage, they can now go to the contract role. And this contract role is basically a contract is a process is hiring someone for a limited time period. So let's say 6 months or 3 months, for instance. So the benefit of the contract is that you don't necessarily have to worry about firing them, since the expectation is that the contract will end after the time period has come to an end. So all you can do is you can hire them on contracts for, let's say, 3 months, and then give them more responsibilities, and then you give them a deliverable. So that means they know so they are well aware of what you expect them to deliver upon, and is well agreed upon. So you now test them based on those deliverables you give them, so that it's seen as objective and not subjective, right? So the benefits of having a well-defined scope and timeline is that, let's say if you're hiring your family, right, you're less likely to be biased or to have your judgment clouded if you have a well-defined scope at this stage. The next stage is the extended contract. So at this point, if they pass the second stage, they can extend the contract, and this time give them more responsibilities and integrate them more into the team. So the benefit of this is that you can test if they jive well with the team, if they are able to work with the team. You can see if they reduce the morale of the team or if they increase the morale of the team. So this gives you a chance to see how well they jive in with the organization. And if they don't, you don't have to fire them. You can just let them go after their contract is extended. Then if they pass the stage, you can now fully hire them. So this might sound complicated, but I think it's worth following this process because the cost of hiring the wrong person is a lot more costly than this complicated process. So it's better to take your time to hire the right person than to hire the wrong person and who might destroy your organization and set you back many months or years. So the fourth principle is to know every room in your house. So the mistake a lot of founders tend to make is to focus on their role. Let's say they are the CEO, so they just focus on, let's say, managing resources, and they just kind of leave everyone in their departments to do it on their own. But that's a mistake, because as we all know, no one is as passionate about your business as you, right? If we look at most successful founders, they're usually involved in every aspect of their business. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are doing everything on their own, but it means that they are aware of what's going on around their organization, especially in the initial stages, right? We want to make sure that everyone is meeting their requirements, everyone is getting everything done. You're periodically checking against the deliverables you're giving them. Maybe you're even working with them as well. So the benefit of this is that you're aware of everything that's going on, and you're also in a better position to make decisions. You're also in a better position to catch inefficiencies or if there are any problems, which you can easily solve. But if you just kind of silo off responsibility to others without keeping them accountable, you might not be aware of leakages in the system. Maybe there is some kind of corruption going on, or maybe there's some kind of serious inefficiency. You might not be aware, and you might be confused as to why your business is not going as well as you expect. So initially, it's very important that you are aware of what's going on around the business. So here are sample things you can do. For example, if you have a finance department, maybe you have someone keeping the balance, maybe an accountant that's keeping records of your finance expenses and all that. You could periodically check that everything balances, right? That there is no fraud going on there. Maybe like monthly, you could go through the records and see if everything is going on well. So that way, if there's a fraud, you can easily catch it. In the sales department, for instance, I'll advise that everyone who creates a business is involved in their sales department. Even if you're not the chief sales officer, you should definitely be trying to sell the product, because no one is going to be as passionate about you on your business as you. So the best salesperson is always going to be you, but you can definitely hire someone to help you. So operation, you should definitely be aware of bottlenecks, right? So as the CEO, it's your responsibility to make sure everything goes smoothly, everything works smoothly in the organization. So make sure you're aware of the bottlenecks or inefficiencies and try to remove them. And the next one is very important, people and culture. Make sure that there's a high morale in the organization, right? That there is no one reducing the morale or maybe creating dysfunction. So make sure that everyone feels like they're welcome, everyone feels like their voice is heard. So it's your responsibility as a CEO to make sure this happens, because if you don't get this right, then it will greatly reduce the efficiency of your team and to affect the organization overall. So next is marketing and branding. So as you all know, probably marketing or the brand you create greatly influences the probability that people will actually buy your product. If your brand is associated with something bad, then people would probably not want to be associated with your business. And it's your responsibility as the CEO or as the founder to make sure that your branding is done correctly. So you can do this by making sure anyone who represents the organization, right, doesn't kind of aligns with the brand you're trying to create. So don't just let your employees act anyhow, especially those representing you outside. Make sure that they meet the brand, whether it's a dressing, whether it's a way of speaking, whether it's a behavior, a characteristics, because a bad employee might greatly damage your brand and affect your sales, for instance. And next is product and delivery. So you have to make sure that every product is delivered on time and done very efficiently. So next is graduated responsibilities. So this is probably something that most people are aware of, right? So even within most organizations, I'm sure you're aware of a junior software engineer, for instance, and a senior software engineer, for instance, right? So the idea is that every level comes with different responsibilities. And to him who more is given, more should be expected, right? So the benefit of this is that you kind of reward people for diligence somehow, right? By giving them more responsibilities and also more compensation in terms of salary. And that way, it's kind of incentivizes people to put in their best efforts. So an example graduated responsibility is this L1 to L4 system. This system is practiced, for example, in Google. So I'm going to explain how this is the different levels and what we expect from them. So in L1, this is the observed system. So at this point, the person at this level can't really make solo decisions yet, but so they are closely observed to see if they meet the requirement. So the reason why we have this is that we want to make sure that they don't really spoil anything. So for example, if you're creating an application, you don't want someone at this level to be the one responsible for deploying the product because they might make a serious mistake that will greatly harm the business. So the next level is L2, assist level. So at this stage, you're responsible for getting a specific task done. So you have more responsibility, but you don't yet own full deliverables. So the next stage, L3, that's where you own deliverables. So you actually are more independent in this stage. We allow you to make decisions, but you're not yet managing people. But in the L4 lead level is where you actually manage people. So I have another micro exercise. So just write down your opinion and keep it to yourself. So think of someone in a team you've worked with before, whether it's a team you created or a team you were a part of. What level were they at, and what level were they treated at? So, think of if you've been part of a team, right, or a club before, right? Has the level someone operated at corresponded with the level they were actually at? So, for example, what was the CEO or the senior salesperson of the team? Was he actually operating like a senior, or was someone else actually getting all the job done? So what we find is that the person who is the most effective in a lot of teams actually tends to not have the title, right? So the person who has the title in a lot of organizations tends not to be the person that is actually getting the job done. So has that ever happened to you before? So just think about it and write down your answers if you have one. So I believe everyone should be done by now. So the next principle is you can't chase a 10,000 alone. So as everyone has probably heard this saying before. One will chase 1,000 and two will chase 10,000 to flights. This is not just a nice saying. This is actually very true, right? If you find someone that you can work with, right, the effectiveness really multiplies. So it doesn't just so the benefits of adding an effective team member, right, is exponential rather than additive. So if you can find the right person, you can actually 10x your output. And we're going to talk about how you can do this and the reason for that. So the reason why things tend to exponentially increase, the output tends to exponentially increase when you add the right people to your team is something called division of labor. So division of labor basically is basically specializing in what you're good at. And if everyone specializes at what they are good at, so let's say I'm an IT guy, I specialize in my IT, and someone else is a sales guy, he specializes in his sales and everything, and we both do it very well, right? Since we are working at our 100% at what we are good at, that greatly benefits the organization as a whole. As opposed to me, right, doing things I'm not good at. So let's say I'm an IT guy, but I'm forced to do sales and I'm forced to do accounting and all that, and I happen to be not so good at it, right? So I'll do my IT well, but my sales will be not done so well. And as a result of that, that greatly diminishes the effectiveness of the organization, right? But unfortunately, a lot of founders, especially small founders, tend not to keep this in mind. They want to do everything themselves. They will rather run a they'll rather run a $10,000 business than a $1 million business because they feel comfortable doing everything on their own. They feel comfortable being isolated. But the truth is that you're never going to reach your peak potential if you don't work with someone. If you observe most successful businesses, right, you can think of have co-founders or have a board of directors, for instance. So I'm going to talk about the different ways you can collaborate to ensure that this principle applies to you in your organization. So the first one is you could have a co-founder. So rather than founding your organization on your own, right, you can find someone that is also very motivated and work with them to find the organization. So one popular example of this is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, for instance, right? They were both very motivated people and their skills complemented. So Steve Jobs, when he was founding Apple, he was very good at sales. He was the idea guy. And Steve Wozniak was more of the technical guy. I'm sure most people must have heard of them before. So they were able to work together in a harmonious way and create one of the greatest companies ever founded in the world. So the benefits of having a co-founder is that you can share load. So let's say if you're not available on one day, right, the entire organization is not going to shut down. Someone else can cover for you. But if you work alone, right, let's say you're sick or you have to take a break, the entire organization has to shut down. So that's one benefit. Another is accountability. So if you work alone, you have to keep yourself accountable. And we all know that that's often very difficult to do. But if you work with someone, then you have someone keeping you accountable and you're more likely to put in your best effort since you don't want to disappoint the person. So next is complementary skills. So like mentioned earlier, right, you have the ability to specialize. I know this seems to contradict what I said earlier, but just because you have your hand in every aspect of the organization doesn't mean that you're not specialized. So you're still going to specialize in one thing, but you're just going to be aware of everything else going on in the organization. Right. So if everyone specializes and does whatever they are doing effectively, but they are still kind of, sharing idea with one another, that increases the overall effectiveness of the organization. So another way you can collaborate is to have a board of directors. So these are basically people keeping you accountable. They offer an external perspective. They offer strategic accountability and access to networks and credibility. So the benefit of this is that you can work with experts, people who are more experienced than you, for instance, people who can give you a different perspective, people who, like you said, right, in a multitude of counsel, there is wisdom. So you can have an opportunity to get different perspectives. You can also get networks, you can also get investments and all that. So another thing to keep in mind is that collaboration, especially at a small stage, at a small organization level, is often better than competition. Yes, I know there is some benefits to competing. Competing might motivate you to put in your best. But what I find is that a lot of small organizations will benefit more from collaborating with each other than competing. The reason is that, especially if there's already a well-established business in your field or in the area you're working at. Let's say you're trying to create another tech company. If you focus on competing with others rather than collaborating, then it will be easy for the big established companies to actually buy you out, for instance, or compete with you. But if you work together and collaborate, that makes you stronger and better able and be in a better position to collaborate effectively with your competition. The next principle is something that might seem very counterintuitive. So it's to have the mindset of giving first and always. So I know it's said by most economic textbooks that the aim of a business is to maximize profits. But I say that, especially for small businesses, your aim shouldn't be to maximize profit, but your aim should be to provide value to people, to give first, to see how you can help people out. And if you focus on that, then you'll be in a better position to maximize profits in the future, right? So this might not seem strategic at all, but it's actually based on research. It actually tends to work out in the long run. So the idea is that you're playing the long-term game. So let's say if you're trying to start like a small business, let's say you're trying to start a website creation business, right? As a small business, you're not really well known. So what you want to focus on at this stage is to build your brand. And the best way to build your brand is to be known as the business that isn't overly profit driven, but is actually looking for a way to give back to society. So you might ask, how might you do this? So one way you can do this is by offering your service for free initially. So if you're creating like websites for people, for instance, you can offer your service for free to the first 10 customers, for instance. So that way, right? First of all, there isn't much of a pressure to deliver very effectively. You have the opportunity to learn, right? And also you've kind of created a customer base, right? And by doing that, and once you create the base, once you create the brand, once you have a large number of customers, then you can now start charging for your services. And if you're observant, a lot of companies actually do this, right? In the software engineering world, we call this the freemium model. So a lot of products you use are actually free. But for you to get to a higher level, then you now have to pay for it, right? So this is a good strategy that a lot of people ignore. So let's say if you're starting a website business, or let's say you're trying to start a new shop in an environment, you could offer services for free, for instance, or you could like, let's say, sponsor competitions. Like, for example, a lot of companies sponsor scholarships to children in the organization or the community they are working in. They're not doing this necessarily out of the kindness of their heart, but they're trying to build a brand. By building a brand, they kind of lock in customers that will be very loyal to them in the future. So the general idea is that you're playing the long-term game. So don't be too money hungry or too focused on short-term gains that you'll forget to play the long-term game and build a brand for yourself. So this is our next exercise. We are going to go over your initial answers and see how they have changed based on this, or what we have talked about so far. So we've already asked this question before. Have you tried building an organization, a team, or project before? So what specifically went wrong? Write down your answers and you can compare them with what you answered initially. And then number 3 is, what principle from today would have made the biggest difference? Right? So what principle that we have talked about today would have made the biggest difference? So number 4 is, what did you do that you now recognize was a mistake? So when you are running the club, organization, business, was there something you did that you recognize as a mistake? And then number 5 is, what would you do differently, knowing what you know now? So you can write down. So had everyone finished? Everyone done with the exercise? Raise your hands if you're done. All right, see a hand at the back. So yeah, just write down your answers and you can compare them with what you said initially. I'll give you 1 more minute to be done. Okay, so I believe everyone should be done by now. Let's move on. So let's go back to the original story I told initially. And we'll talk about the decisions Marcus made and the better decisions he would have made if he knew what we now know. So the first decision he made that was probably a mistake was to quit immediately and hire his friends, right? So based on what we now know, right, we know that the better thing for him to have done would have been to work with an organization for, let's say, about 6 months or 1 year, right? So maybe find a similar organization, work with them, and learn from them, right? Maybe as an apprentice or as a collaborator, or just someone that's helping them. So the benefit of this will be that he will learn from them. He will learn what to do, what not to do, and he can now combine the ideas he has and see how he can improve on what he learns. So the next mistake he made was that he gave titles, right? He didn't give it to those who earned it. Rather, he gave it to those that he liked, maybe his family and friends. And we know that's a mistake because they didn't earn the titles, right? And that eventually came back to bite him. So what he could have done initially was to start alone, right? Validate the idea, and then create a system that works. A system for hiring, for instance, a system for interviewing people, and make sure they actually work. And then if we recall from the story, right, there was some chaos by month 6, right? Everything seemed good initially, but then some cracks began to show, right? People weren't responding the way he expected. People weren't as effective as he hoped, as productive as he hoped. He was pretty much doing everything because he didn't really hold them to any standard. But this time, right, he didn't have that problem because he had his first hire on contract by month 2. And since the person was on contract, he was motivated to actually do a good job for him because he knows that if he doesn't do a good job, he will get fired. So as a result of that, he put in a lot of effort. His hire put in a lot of effort and he actually was very productive. And as a result, his business actually grew a lot faster. Then, if we recall, the next thing that happened was that he pretty much started doing everything on his own and his team kind of fell apart as a result of, the fact that things weren't done effectively. But in the better way, right, the team didn't fall apart, but instead, right, he actually had up to 12 people by year 3. So he hired slowly initially, but in the long run, he actually had more people working for him that were more effective. So just by following this better plan, right, he eventually got the vision he was hoping for, and he actually got more that he wanted after some time had passed. So the idea of this is that this might be a slow process, but in the long run, you're more likely to succeed if you follow this process. So let's go again through the 7 principles, right, that kind of apply to this process. So the first is to start small and validate before you scale. It's very important that you start small. Don't just make major decisions like hiring a bunch of people, renting an office department, right? Just create a minimum viable product. That's what we call it in tech world, right? Maybe work in your apartment for a while. Maybe create a simple prototype, things of that nature. maybe hire a few people on contract, or maybe give a few people a task to do, right? Just don't overcommit initially. Give yourself time to evaluate before you scale. So next is know every department, right? Make sure you build empathy by knowing every department. Maybe take time out to actually work in the department. I know of a story of a CEO that actually works as a cleaner once in a while because he wants to know how it feels to work in every department. And that way you build empathy and you're in a better position to make the right decisions as the CEO. Next is to give graduated responsibility. So if you recall, right, don't just hire someone as a senior without them proving themselves. Start them off at a lower level and then let them rise up the ranks as they show competency and accountability. So next is to work for others first. Swallow your pride, basically. Work for others. You're not going to regret it. Next is to hire on contract, right? So rather than hiring permanently right away, hire on contract. That way you can get the opportunity to see if they are a good fit for your company before you commit to them. Next is to apply the coordination algorithm, collaborate powerfully. So basically, the coordination algorithm is to give to others first, right? Collaborate with others, help others, right? Help work with people as much as possible, and you're more likely to succeed that way. So the next is to give first. Reputation is built through generosity. So don't be too money focused initially. I know, like they say, as a business person, you're meant to maximize profits. But if you focus on giving value first, even at a loss initially, then eventually, you're going to actually make more profits in the long run. So if you observe most tech companies, for instance, most of them actually run at a loss to gain customers and to build a brand before they start making profits. I think it took Amazon 11 years before they got profitable. That might seem foolish to some, but it's actually very wise because eventually they made more profit than they would have if they focused on profits initially. So the final exercise, right, which you can do, just write down one specific action you're going to take in the next 7 days, right? Approach someone to work on a project for you before offering a full role, for instance, right? Or you can just approach someone and talk with them, maybe brainstorm with someone on what kind of projects you could work with and how you would, create the system. So just try and gain experience in finding a co-founder, for instance. Then maybe spend a week inside the department you don't fully understand. So maybe find an organization you know about and try and understand how it works. So for example, if you know someone that works in a shop or if you have contacts with an organization, you can just send them a text and see if you can work with them for a while. I'm sure a lot of people might be very flattered by that and they might actually allow you to work with them. So just spend 1 week working with someone and gain some experience. So next, have an honest conversation with someone you've given too much too soon to. So if there's someone that you feel like you're giving too much too soon to, that means you're giving them a lot, but they are not really meeting the expectation, right? Just make it a point to have a conversation with them, right? Just do it. It might be scary, but it's actually not as scary in reality. So just make a point to do that. So next is identify a co-founder or an advisor you've been putting off approaching. So the idea is just choose one thing, one specific action you can take within the next 7 days and make a commitment to do it, right? Within the next 7 days or thereabout, or let's say 1 month. So just write it down and try and do it if possible. All right, so thanks everyone. Hope everyone learned something today. I hope everyone, most importantly, took an actionable step or has a plan to take an actionable step on how they can build a business successfully. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, sir. So there are questions, but for the question, I think I will ask first, and I will give you a bit of context on what is going on in this program currently. So at this phase, they've been grouped. We have about 4 groups, and each group has been tasked to pick a sector and develop like a solution or a product around an identified problem.
Okay.
So they've not started yet. Some of them are still trying to decide which niche they are going to focus on. So I want you to maybe in 5 minutes give them some hints or tips on how to go about validating their ideas if they finally come up, once they finally come up with their ideas. How, like, the question will be like this: how do you validate an idea? What's the process? What are the steps, like, as they are stepping out to try to validate the ideas in their head, or even identify problems?
Okay, yeah. That's a very good question, and it's something that we often think about as a researcher. It's something I have to deal with a lot because research requires me to work with a lot of ideas and a lot of people and to know what to focus on. So what I find is that the best way to validate an idea is to actually just do it, right? So a lot of times, right, it's very hard to know the right idea until you do it. So that's why I like this idea of starting small and growing, right, rather than just jumping all in. So in my experience, the best way to validate an idea is to do it for a while, right? Do multiple ideas for a while. Maybe like give yourself a time limit, let's say 1 week. Try out this idea, see how it goes. Then the next week, try something out. Then next week, try something out. And then what happens is that as you try different ideas, right, you gain experience, you gain better perspective. And then when you're done, you can actually be in a better position to decide which idea you want to work with better. So I would say there's a reason why in school, right, you do a lot of subjects. Even if you want to be an engineer, they still make you do like English or literature, for instance, or history. A lot of schools do that. But then as you gain more experience, you now begin to specialize more, right? Because when you're just starting, you're not really in a position to decide what you want to do. And even if you're decided, there's still some things you can learn from there's still a lot you can learn from working in other departments or other fields, which you can apply into the field you're interested in. So for example, right, even though I'm more of an engineer, I have learned a lot from studying literature. For the benefit of literature, it helps you come up with a story, for instance, an appealing story that might attract customers to you. So that's an example of how, even though I'm an engineer, things I learned from literature can actually be beneficial to me and to help me in the long run. So I'll say is that don't be too focused on the idea you do or whatever. Don't be too focused on getting it right initially. Just make sure you do whatever you do very well, and then give yourself a specific time period. And then after that time period, you can now evaluate and see how you feel about the task you worked on. Does that make sense to everyone?
That was for you.
Yeah.
Okay, if there was no clarity, this is time to ask if the person you're talking to have done what you're trying to do over and over in different projects. So can we take question? Please narrow it down to your use case, your concerns, you're worried about, or what you're working on, or even if it's outside of it, please, questions. Is that a hand? All right, start. Wisdom.
Okay, sir, my question is, you made mention about deliverables like 2 times. So I want to ask, what do you mean by deliverables? And perhaps what you're doing, is there a possibility that what you're using may not have deliverables? So is there a way that because you say when mentioned that you should keep out deliverables, I want to ask first, what is the delivery? And is there a possibility that if you're building something that does not have deliverables, is there any possibility like that? That's my question. I don't know if you just answer.
Okay. So a deliverable is what you expect to have at the end of the process, right? So if you're working in an organization, for instance, right, as an engineer, let's say you're trying to build a house. So the house is the deliverable, right? If you're working in sales, for instance, then the customers are the deliverables. So deliverables are objective metrics by which we can grade the effectiveness of what you're doing, right? I said, is it possible to not have deliverables? I'll say if you don't have deliverables, it's very hard to really keep people accountable. So I'll say I would greatly advise for you to create deliverables. Even if you don't have deliverables, you can create one for yourself. So for example, if you're learning, for instance, if you're in school, right, and you're trying to learn, a good way to create deliverables would be to like maybe create questions, for instance, to see if you have learned something. So that's basically what an exam is. If there is no exam, right, then it's very hard to know, or there's no real motivation for most students to learn because there's no incentive for them to get the job done. So I'll say if you don't have deliverables, which means some objective metrics to measure if the job has gotten done, you've gotten the work done. Now I'll say you should create one for yourself. Does that make sense?
Right. Please speak up. The mic is far from me, or you can come forward.
I just want to ask this as how you said, the way most organization is built. So you said have an idea. That's number one. The second is register business. The third, I want to say something is hire people you know. So, for example, I've started an organization called a book. So I started with people I know. Like it's not people that should I say that are close to me that I'm seeing that are doing what I'm doing. So I kind of okay, let me start with this one. And it was so frustrating because these persons like they feel they know you, like they know everything about you, and they start frustrating you. Like for example, starting with a family, you said something about family, starting with your own family. No, there will be no seriousness in it. I think there will be no seriousness. So what I did was I have to just I still kept them in the team and I had to look elsewhere, go outside, getting some persons to, join the team to make it make sense. Because this person, they are not listening. When you say they are doing C, and it was like familiarity was immediate. So yes, CPD was in it. So and when these other persons came in, and a lot of things changed, then they are like, it's group now is being more serious. This person, then this is IPJ. Okay, I am maybe to go. Let's calm down and start listening to him. So I think, starting with people it will be a lot of stress. There will be a lot of problem. Like if I'm building like a tech organization and I happen to have people that I will not start with them. Or I might just look like pick that one or two, but majorly, I will not start with people I know because I think they will stress me out so much.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you. So like when I talked about starting with people you know, I actually framed it as something that you don't necessarily want to do. Personally, I'm not against working with people I know, but I just have to make sure that they are competent. So that means I'll hold them to the same standard that I'll hold anyone else at. If I feel like I can't do that, then I'll rather work with someone I don't know. So I greatly agree with your perspective. And a lot of times, especially if you don't have authority, right, in the relationship. Let's say you're not the elder, for instance. You might not have the ability to hold them accountable. So in that case, I'll advise that you don't work with them. Instead, work with other outsiders. But that said, when working with outsiders, you should still make sure that they too are responsible and accountable. So hold them to a well-defined standard, and make sure you just hire the right people. That's what really matters at the end of the day. The right people could be your family or it could be outsiders, but just have a consistent system for hiring the right people, basically. Does that make sense?
So, I wanted to ask, for a startup, do you really look out for loyalty first or competence?
Honestly, I think competence is better than loyalty, although they are both important. But loyalty is not really going to benefit you that much, because even if someone isn't loyal, if they have enough reason to stay, let's say you give them enough compensation, for instance, then they are going to stay. As you know, in the tech world, right, it's very notorious for having people like changing jobs every other, like maybe every 6 months or every 10 months, right? So that's already the culture within the tech world. So we aren't very loyal, right? But if you can, get someone to stay, even if he's not loyal, if you give him enough reason to stay, he's going to stay. So I value competency more than loyalty, especially in industries. But there are certain industries where loyalty might be more important. But from my experience in the tech world, I think competency is far more important than loyalty.
So, the reason why I asked that question was, I think within the first 3 months of you starting up this company, there are ideas that you have to share to them so that they really know what you want to bring up. And then within these 3 months, they know basically everything about this company, right? And then if they are not loyal to you, probably at the long run, they might decide that, okay, even if I don't get something as this or something that you want to do, they can actually go and start up for the same thing, and then you guys start becoming competitors. So I think loyal.
Yeah, that's true, right? But that's why we have NDAs and all that. So I don't know how it works where you are, but most times, right, you kind of sign certain agreements which they can't break if you're doing something that is important. Like maybe you're working on a trade secret. But what I find is that a lot of times, right, ideas are easy, ideas are cheap. The problem a lot of times is implementation. So I wouldn't worry much about people stealing your ideas initially, right? I think we tend to overemphasize how good the ideas are because we are kind of biased. But the truth is that everyone is focused on their own idea. If your idea is very good, right, then I, if your idea is very good, then you should focus more on deliverability than the idea itself. If someone else can deliver on your idea better than you, then you're probably not even worthy to have the idea. That's how I see it personally, right? Because if you have a good idea and you can't deliver upon it, and someone comes in and delivers upon it better than you, then maybe you aren't worthy of the idea. That's how I see it. But in reality, right, the chances are someone is probably not going to steal your idea, because getting it done is so difficult that people would rather just work on their own idea. Because most people are more, it's just like your child versus someone else's child, right? In everyone's eyes, their child is the best child in the world because it's their own, right? It's something they birth, kind of. So that's how ideas tend to be in reality. It's only if you're already very successful that people will steal your idea. And if people are stealing your idea, it means that you already have an edge, right? So if someone is able to steal your idea at that point and even surpass you, then that means that you're probably not very effective and you probably have bigger things to worry about. So let me give you an example. For example, on YouTube, I'm sure you guys watch different YouTubers, right? Like maybe different skit makers. And a lot of people copy the skit makers, but it's very hard for people who copy skit makers to actually surpass them. Because the skit makers, even though they came up with the ideas, they're also very effective at doing it. So it's not just the idea that made them successful. What made them successful was their effectiveness, right? The ability to execute on the idea very well. So a lot of people could copy the idea, but they don't attain the same level of success a lot of times. So does that make sense?
Should it be like, for example, I have an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Start up an organization, and then okay, how should I do this? Okay, I mean an organization whereby the person that organized it is not the one that brought the idea. What the person knows best to do is just to gather people.
Yeah.
And then the ones doing the main work are the people that the person has gathered. So should that person lead the organization because he gathered everyone?
Should that person lead the organization because he can gather people?
Yes.
Well, I would say that the ability to gather is like a specific skill called management, right? The ability to coordinate people. But I don't think that person should necessarily lead because running an organization is much more than managing people. Running an organization means you have a vision, you have where you're going, right? And you're trying to get there. So if you don't have a vision, then you probably shouldn't be running the organization. You should just be taking instructions for the person with the vision and then help the person organize people to achieve the goal. So the person with the vision, in my opinion, should be the one leading, right? At least to some degree. Then you can have a CTO, like a chief or a COO. So that's a chief operations manager. So that person will be responsible for getting the job done. To be like his right-hand man, but he's still the main guy in the business because he has the vision and he's trying to get it done. I think there's a saying that says, without vision, the people perish. So if you don't have a vision, then the organization is very likely to die because you could just be doing things but you don't know where you're going. You're just moving around in circles.
All right, so that's it for today. Thank you for your time. We're grateful. It was insightful.
All right. Thank you everyone for having me. Hope you all learned something and hopefully I'll see some great companies coming out of this. I look forward to seeing them.